So let's see if I can test your memories. How many of you remember at the start of the lockdown, for a couple of Sundays, we were looking at 1 Corinthians 1 verse 10 through to chapter 4 and verse 16. Now, I know some of you weren't able to meet by Zoom, and that's fine, that's no problem at all. But for those of you who did, you remember that just for a couple of Sundays, we looked at that passage in 1 Corinthians, a passage that focuses on the deep things of God. And Paul is writing to the church at Corinth because of the tension that there is between Paul and the church. And so Paul wants to introduce the church to the deep things of God, things that the Holy Spirit had revealed to the Apostle Paul. And it's almost as if Paul thinks the answer to any tension, the answer to problems in the church, is to look at the deep things of God. Now, what I'd like to do on a Sunday morning is turn back to those deep things. And so to begin with, let's remind ourselves of them. So if you've got your Bibles then, we're in 1 Corinthians, first chapter, verse 10. And this section runs, as I've said, to chapter 4 and verse 16. And when you look at verse 10 of chapter 2, that's where you see this phrase, the deep things of God. So take a look at chapter 2 and verse 10. 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 10. But God has revealed to us through his Spirit, the Spirit that searched all things, the Spirit has revealed the deep things of God. Now, it's a wonderful thing to be able to do on a Sunday morning in a pandemic, to think together about the deep things of God. Most of us, I think, are mature Christian people, and so we should well be able, with the help of the Spirit of God, to look together at the deep things of God. And in that section of 1 Corinthians, there are a number of deep things. The first of them is the foolishness of God, and that's what we look together at in the early days of the pandemic. So if we take a look at chapter 1 into chapter 2, Paul has a great deal to say about the foolishness of God. And just as a reminder, three things. Paul tells us that the foolishness of God is seen in the cross. So the cross, which to the Jews is a stumbling block and to the Greeks is foolishness, to the Christian, the cross is the wisdom of God and the power of God. So the method by which God chooses to save men and women is foolish. It's the cross. And then we looked at the message. So the message is, the method is the cross, rather. The message is preaching. And what Paul will say in chapter 1 and chapter 2 is preaching, what I'm trying to do now, is a very foolish thing. And there have been many times when I felt foolish in the pulpit. And you may well, as those who listen to preaching, sometimes be tempted to think you're listening to a very foolish person trying his best to bring you a message. The method of preaching is foolish. And then what Paul tells us in chapter 1 and 2 is the members of the church, they are also foolish. Now, this is a tricky thing to say, I guess. But if you look down chapter 1, especially verses 26, 27, you'll see Paul saying, consider your calling, brethren, not many wise, not many noble. Christian people, you and I, we are fools. We are fools in the eyes of the clever and the powerful and the rich and the elite. So foolishness is the way that God has chosen to work. Foolishness of the cross, foolishness of preaching, foolishness in terms of the membership of the church. But what Paul will say is the foolishness of God is wiser than men. That what the world takes to be foolishness is actually the deep wisdom of God. And so, Paul tells the church at Corinth that he chooses to be a fool. Foolishness is what the church should embrace. Foolishness is what every Christian should embrace. Every one of us should seek to be a fool. And this was not what the Corinthian church wanted to hear. And I think it's not really what the Christian church has ever wanted to hear. If God chooses foolishness, then we are not wiser than God. And so we should embrace foolishness ourselves. Now that's the first of the deep things, how God chooses foolishness. The second of these deep things that you see in this section is the one that we're going to be thinking about on a Sunday morning. And it's the idea of the weakness of God. And then the third of these deep things, we may come on to who knows, but just for us to know, the third of these deep things are the mysteries of God. And in this section of 1 Corinthians, Paul will hint at the great mysteries of God. So as an example, take a look at chapter 2 and look from verse 7. So 1 Corinthians 2, following from verse 7. Now we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew. For had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now here's the mystery. It's in verse 9. As it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man, the things which God has prepared for those who love him. So there's mysteries that have been revealed. And in fact, the deep things of God were mysteries that the Spirit of God revealed. The fact that God chooses foolishness was a mystery that the Spirit revealed. The same when it comes to weakness. Weakness is a mystery, but the Spirit has told us. But what Paul says in verse 9 is there's a final mystery that has not yet been revealed. And in fact, eye hasn't seen it yet. Ear hasn't heard it. It's the final mystery of what God has prepared for those who love him. So there's one mystery left, which we will one day be shown by God. And it's the final preparation of the glory of the church. That's the last mystery. So we've got foolishness, we've got weakness, and we've got mystery. These are the deep things of God. So I hope we feel ready to look together at the weakness of God and to think together about what that means for us. So to do that, then, what I want us to think about is this church at Corinth. And if you wanted one word to sum up the church at Corinth, you would take the word boasting. And it's a great word. It's a wonderful Greek word. It's a word that can be translated as pride. The word can be translated as glory. It can also mean strength, power, greatness. Now, this church at Corinth were big into boasting. And they were a church that wanted strength. And what I've done over these weeks, and you can do it if you want, you can just trace how many times Paul uses the word boast when he talks to this church at Corinth. They boast in how intellectual they are. So they're all well versed in philosophy. No doubt they would be a church full, if they were around today, of professional people, university lecturers. They would be a congregation made up of people with fancy titles and important positions. So they were boasted in their intellectual abilities. This church, they boasted in the spiritual gifts that they were able to exercise together. So they boasted in the fact that they spoke in tongues, they had interpretation of tongues, they had prophecy, they had faith, they had whatever it was that's in that list there in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14. They boasted in their spiritual vibrancy, if you like. They were very alive, if you want to use that term, in terms of their spiritual gifts. They were a church who boasted in preachers. They loved the big preachers of the day. They loved a big name to come along on a Sunday and to preach to them. So there's nothing they like better than having some fancy fella out the front, dressed smartly, no doubt, who was able to deliver wonderful sermons. They never fell asleep in them. Sermons that tickled their fancy and made them laugh, and you know, the sort of thing, great occasions. They boasted in men. And as you read these two epistles, they seemed to boast in how much money they had. They boasted in the numbers who came along on a Sunday. And they even boasted in how fair and tolerant and broad-minded and liberal they were in their approach to things and their outlook on things like sex and relationships and worship of demons and idols. They were a church who had a great deal, so they thought, to be proud of. And this church at Corinth were puzzled and annoyed by this little man called the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul had been used by God to establish the church at Corinth, but they had outgrown Paul. They'd moved on from this funny little man with his funny appearance and his very poor speaking ability and his boring, repetitive sermons on the cross and sin and judgment and resurrection. They were bored by hearing the same thing Sunday by Sunday. They'd moved on to Apollos. They'd moved on to others, bigger, better, greater things. So they were very puzzled by this little man who kept writing to them, this little man who kept sending his deputies to them. And they were very annoyed when one of their own members wrote to this little man to tell him about the problems in the church. Now, this woman, Chloe, was very concerned by what she saw in the church at Corinth, and so she added her own worries to a letter that the church sent to Paul. Now, this letter, 1 Corinthians, is filled with questions that they wanted Paul to answer, so they were happy enough to put the questions to Paul, theological questions. But what they're doing is this. In asking Paul a whole series of questions, they want to show Paul how clever they are. They want to show how much they know. They want to show what sort of struggles they were having. So they want to make a good impression on this little funny man. But in that letter, Chloe puts in, whether she does it secretly or openly, we can't tell, but she puts in an account of her own worries. So chapter 1, verse 10 or so, through to chapter 5, these are Chloe's worries about the church that she talks to Paul about, and he answers them. And it's in his answer that he starts to talk about the deep things of God. So what I want us to do now is notice how Paul responds to the church at Corinth. Don't forget now, they are a church who are proud, boasting, great reputation. Everything's going on in the church at Corinth, whether it's exciting worship, whether it's having revelations of the Spirit of God. Everything's going on in the church at Corinth. It's the sort of church you'd want to go to. Sort of church you'd want to be part of. It's always exciting, never a dull moment. There are even arguments going on between different people. Now, here comes Paul, and what Paul has to offer this church can be summed up in one word, if you like. Paul offers them weakness. Now, imagine that to a church like the Corinthians. To be told that the way of God is a way of weakness. It's not about strength. It's not about numbers. It's not about gifts. It's not about activities. The church isn't about money. The church, says Paul, is about weakness. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, I can well imagine the shock of this church being told that the way of God is the way of weakness. And what surprises me is not just how I can imagine the church at Corinth reacting, but what amazes me at a much deeper level, it's as if the church since then has forgotten that the way of God is the way of weakness. Because even to our day, what seems to matter to churches is strength. Everything's about strength. So you think about the churches you know, think about other Christian people, churches you may have visited. Isn't everything about strength? We want to advertise what we are doing to everybody. We want other people to know what's going on. We want to tell people how many we are, what ages we've got, how many younger ones we have. We want to talk about, don't we, how many non-Christians are coming. We want to talk about how many people are being converted. It's always strength that we want to boast in and rejoice in and talk about and emphasize and brag. What's happened to us, do you think? What's happened to the church over 2,000 years where we seem to have utterly forgotten this very basic idea that Paul explains to the church at Corinth? It's not about strength. It's not about cleverness. It's not about gifts. It's about weakness. Weakness is the key, says Paul, to God and his works and his ways. So let's turn to 2 Corinthians and the passage we read earlier. 2 Corinthians then, chapter 11. But before we take a look at that, what I need to show you is what you have in 2 Corinthians at the end is a mirror of what we've seen in 1 Corinthians at the beginning. So, if you've got a Bible with you, if you haven't, no problem. 2 Corinthians 10, 11, 12, and 13 are a mirror of 1 Corinthians, chapters 1 to 4. It's really useful, I think, to take these two blocks of Scripture and put them side by side. So 1 Corinthians 1 to 4, 2 Corinthians 10 to 13. Paul is saying in both of these sections essentially the same thing. He is talking about the weakness of God, the foolishness of God. He's talking about boasting. He's talking about foolish ways. So it's really useful to put them together and to compare them. What I've noticed is this. I'm sure you've seen it before. In chapter 10, you've got Paul repeating that very famous verse that he has at the end of chapter 1. And he says there, look at chapter 10, and so this is 2 Corinthians now, chapter 10 and verse 17. He says there, he who boasts, let him boast in the Lord. Now, I don't want you to turn to it, but if you go to 1 Corinthians 1 and the very last verse, you see exactly the same thing. He's quoting again. And so these two sets of passages, they are useful. And I'm almost tempted to take a look at 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 with you, just so that we can see how much Paul is emphasizing again what he said to the church in an earlier letter. So if you want to boast, says Paul, if you want to be proud, if you want to emphasize strength, if you want to be going around saying how great it all is, you boast in the Lord. Now, that's not something that I think we really understand. You know, it's a phrase you know, don't you? I know you know it. But I don't think any of us get it, because what Paul is saying here, and he said it twice, remember, you glory in the Lord. That means you glory in foolishness, you glory in weakness, and you glory in mystery. That's what it means. Let him who wants to have something to shout about. Don't shout about what your gifts are. Don't shout about how great your church is. Shout about how the Lord works through weakness and foolishness and mystery. So, time is going, I think. Let's just take a look at what we've got. So, 2 Corinthians 11 and verse, what did we say? Verse 29. Now, what Paul does is very clever. He's saying to them, right, you've just gone on and on and on about how great you are. So let me tell you how great I am. And you can almost imagine the Corinthians at this point saying, at last. It's only taken 4 letters to get Paul to get it. We want Paul, we want sermons that we can be proud of. We want sermons that will excite us. We want Paul to know great things. We don't want you going on about foolishness and weakness. Paul, come on, give us something that's going to excite us. Give us something that'll thrill us and motivate us. Tell us, Paul, about great things. So when Paul writes in chapter 11, verse 29, now I'll tell you about great things. You know, you really must at that point think, the Corinthian church, they're about to get what they want. They're about to think wonderful. At last. Now, what does Paul do? Take a look. So from verse 29, if I must boast, I will boast in the things concerning my weaknesses. Oh, you know, the church goes, oh, come on. You just told us you're going to boast, and now you're going on about weaknesses again. And then you get to verse 32. In Damascus, when I was there once, now, you know, if this was a sermon, the congregation now would be desperate for Paul to finish his story. He's going to tell us about a great deliverance he had in Damascus, when he was on his missionary journeys and he was facing down enemies and he was persecuted. He's going to tell us a great story about how he was there and God gave him a wonderful deliverance and the sun stopped in its tracks and all the enemies of God were scattered, because Paul is making a reference here to Joshua and Rahab and the spies. They're about to think they're going to get a great story of strength and boasting. And what do they get? There I was, says Paul, a garrison out front with a warrant for my arrest, surrounded by all these Roman soldiers, and I was there doing the Lord's work, and I was let down by a basket out of the window. If ever there's an anticlimax in the writings of the Apostle Paul, here's the anticlimax. What a letdown that this man had to be secretly, like a little fugitive, let down out of the window and sent on his way. Paul is saying to them, you want boasting? You want to talk about how strong things are, how great things are? Let me tell you this. I'll boast. I'll boast about my weaknesses. I'll boast about my humiliations. I'll boast about how I had to run and hide like a coward from a Roman garrison. That's what I'll boast about. And then as you come to chapter 12, he's almost playing with them, isn't he? It is no doubt useless for me to boast. And then again, but let me come to visions and revelations. Now again, guys, the church at Corinth at this point would be thinking, hooray, He teased us a moment ago with what we thought would be a great story about Damascus. That was a letdown. But let's see what he can tell us now. And Paul is genuinely distressed when he writes chapter 12. He doesn't want to be talking about his experiences. He feels himself not exactly cornered, but he wants to go onto the Corinthians' own territory, really, and show them how stupid they're being. So he starts to talk about this man who was taken 14 years ago up into paradise, where he saw things that he didn't have the words or the language or the mental structures to appreciate. And he starts to talk about that. And really, by this point, the Corinthian church must have been thinking, hooray, about time. And what does he then go on to do? He goes on to talk about a thorn in the flesh. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. And so Paul brings the conversation away from all that glory and boasting and back to weakness. Now, why does he do it? This is where we'll end today. And this is what I wanted to think about going forward. Paul brings the conversation back to weakness because of what Jesus told him. Take a look at verse 9. Jesus said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And for Paul, those words were enough. Weakness is the place where you experience the grace of God. It is in weakness where you experience the perfect grace of God. And so Paul says, that's the moment I understood this deep thing of God, that weakness is the opportunity for grace. And so what I'm going to do, says Paul, I'm going to embrace every opportunity to be weak. And if I embrace every moment of weakness, then I'll know the perfect grace of God. And in knowing the perfect grace of God, then I shall be strong. Now that's our theme going forward. We can't deny our weaknesses. We can't deny them on an individual level. Many of you feel very weak. We can't deny them at a church level. We are weak. But the deep thing of God is this: if we embrace weakness, then we will know the grace of God that is sufficient for us. We'll know the perfect. Remember the word perfect? We've thought together about the perfect love of God on a Sunday night. We'll know the perfect grace of God if we embrace weakness. Now, what many of you are doing is this. Many of you are praying the prayer of Paul. Take a look at it in chapter 12 and verse 8. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. How many of you are asking God to take something away? You're asking him to take something away that you don't like. You're asking God to take something away that is making you weak. And for some of you, what you're asking God to take away may be in your flesh. For others of you, it may be a thorn in the flesh of another kind. But I think all of you are asking God to take something away. And you can ask God to take it away again and again and again, as Paul did. And of course, what you know here is Paul is, Paul, by asking 3 times, is modeling himself on Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus 3 times asked God to remove the cup, to take this cup from me. Paul is very deliberately imitating Jesus in the garden. So we're doing it, aren't we? We're asking God to take away our weakness as a congregation. We're asking God to remove whatever thorn it is. Instead of that, it's embracing the thorn. Can you imagine that? Embracing the thorn. That's the deep thing of God. That's where the weakness of God comes in. And in embracing the thorn, you will know the perfect grace of God. Let's pray.